What if I told you that Celine and Julie Go Boating is actually the same movie as Eyes Wide Shut? It isn't, but some of the ideas in Eyes Wide Shut about a woman transiting between convention and liberation are a decent entry point into this kind of opaque and confusing film. Let's take a step back, though. Unlike Eyes Wide Shut, you might not know much about Celine and Julie Go Boating. What is it? It's a movie. Okay. It's French. It's from the 70s. It's directed by Jacques Rivette. This is a surreal film, but it's not an in-your-face sort of surrealism, I guess. It's not a bunch of psychedelic colors. It's not a trip. It's more subtle surrealism that relies on a lot of narrative trickery, I guess. Let me give you a fair warning that this movie is quite long, although not as long as some of Rivette's movies, and this movie is not gripping, not too exciting, but it is charming, and it is a lot of fun, I think. You really get the feeling that the people who made this movie were cool. And what more could you want? Is this an accessible movie? Kind of. I think some people who might not be super into movies, but are into certain types of the same sort of lifestyle, maybe would vibe with this movie immediately, whereas other people who are more into movies, but don't like being bored or confused, might not like it. This movie is about two women, one named Celine and one named Julie, and they do go boating. Now, apparently in French, going boating is an idiomatic expression similar to a shaggy dog story. Minor spoiler here, but Celine and Julie do go boating. In the standard non-idiomatic sense, they're actually in a boat in this movie at one point. Now, it happens at the end of the film, and their route to the lake is circuitous, to say the least. That might be the best word to describe this movie overall, circuitous. The film reminds me a little bit of a movie called The Saragossa Manuscript. Wojciech Haas directed that, I think. Another movie that has a narrative that is continuously kind of sidetracked. In that movie, we make a ton of left turns, but the mechanism that we use to make those left turns, the steering wheel, if you will, is well defined. Basically, that movie is a story inside of a story inside of a story, a flashback inside of a flashback, like a Matryoshka doll? I don't know how to pronounce that word, actually, but the Russian nesting dolls. It's like listening to me talk, basically. In this movie, Celine and Julie Go Boating, we've got a ton of left turns as well, but the mechanism is much more abstract. It's not, well, here's what he said to me, and then boom, you jump into this story. It's a much stranger relationship between the different pieces. We do have a story within a story, to some extent. We have performances within performances. But understanding how these pieces relate, I guess, is part of the fun. Watching this movie is a bit like having a dream. We slide in and out of various contexts. We see certain pieces again and again. We go back in time. We see certain pieces again and again. Watching this movie is a bit like having a dream. We slide in and out of various contexts. You get the idea. Like the Saragossa Manuscript, this movie starts from something simple and blossoms into a huge story. Both something simple, look at how this simple moment can lead to such a big, a friendship, an endeavor, an adventure, or whatever. But there's also a way in which the mechanics of the movie really escalate from something simple, one person following another, to a much more complex, abstract story, I guess. It really blossoms, this movie. So let's jump back to the outlandish claim I made at the beginning, that this movie isn't all that different from Eyes Wide Shut. Really, it's completely different. Nothing like it. But there is one little element, which is that both, in part, tell the story of a woman intersecting with an establishment. This is just one piece of Eyes Wide Shut, but it's one of the main things here, I think. The tone of these two movies is completely different, where Eyes Wide Shut is defeatist, I guess. Here we've got a lively story, an optimistic story that kind of feels like a blueprint for your own fun and liberatory friendship. At the start of the movie, Celine and Julie are both beholden to some social constraints. Julie has a vague romantic connection. She has some sort of childhood sweetheart. She also has a job at the library. You know, a library, that's a place where you're not supposed to talk, a place where they store all this institutional knowledge. A library is, in some ways, the textbook case of an institutional tie. Celine has a job at a cabaret. Her relationship to her work is a little vague, but we could read this as a performative requirement, some kind of constriction, something. Maybe she's offering up part of herself as part of the performance. Once Celine and Julie start hanging out, these commitments, they're going to fall by the wayside, not terminated out of spite, but rather just through some kind of playfulness. Interestingly, these subplots, with the job, with the romance, they involve a bit of interchangeability, with Celine and Julie standing in for each other, and without people really noticing. This is kind of odd. I think maybe it's hammering home just how disconnected from certain constrictions they are. Through this friendship, they're skirting around things as basic as identity, I guess. I remember when I was growing up, sometimes my sister would invite a bunch of her friends over to our house. There were one or two that I knew, but most of them just kind of blended together. That's not quite what's going on here, but there is a different energy that you have when you're with a group, when you're with a friend. And it's interesting how there's this state, this togetherness that is totally removed from an industrial world, a togetherness that's totally removed from a world that relies on people being individuals with rights and responsibilities. Here we have two friends who are one and the same. They're not really bothered by all this mechanism that might insist that they aren't. Once Celine and Julie meet up, they're going to have some fun, but they're also going to get caught up in a mystery. Now, at first, the exact structure of the mystery is pretty hard to understand. Later, it's slightly clearer. I think that experiencing this is part of the fun, so I'm not going to spoil it exactly, but I'll spoil it a little bit. Let's say that the movie progresses from some kind of collective hallucination to some sort of theatrical performance. As the movie goes on, Celine and Julie really take over the narrative frame of the film, the frame of the film. They take it over. What starts as a kind of bizarre and uncontrollable dream, something very uncertain, ontologically uncertain, turns out to be more of a stodgy performance. Another stiff institution where the players look like ghosts. Okay, a few spoilers here, a little bit. But it turns out that this play that they're going to kind of become aware of, that they're kind of come into the world of, it endangers a young girl. The melodrama that's all these actors are sliding through, it has casualties. It has casualties in this sort of feminine youth thing. Interesting. Eventually, it comes down to Celine and Julie to hijack the play. Again, not through careful strategy, but while laughing, through playfulness, I guess. You get the idea. I talk about fun so much here, it might sound like this movie is one-dimensional, that it's just sort of a romp. It isn't. But yeah, this hijacking of this traditional play, that's a really interesting and significant piece of the movie, I guess. An interesting thing about this movie is its use of magic. There's magic throughout the film. Julie is reading some kind of book about magic when the movie starts. I think at this point, it just seems a little bit quaint. Later, Julie is doing tarot at the library. At this point, it seems like maybe just a fun diversion, like she's playing some sort of game. As things go on, though, the magic in the movie becomes a bit more serious. Towards the end of the film, the girls need to break back into the dream. So they break into the library, and they steal a book of potions and use one to get back into the hallucination. And it works. So we go from having magic as some kind of quaint game to magic actually existing and working within the universe of the film, right? Like I said, Celine and Julie really take over the movie, their ideas, their sort of beliefs in magic or whatever, which first seem like these quaint personal idiosyncrasies, I guess, become accepted by the mechanics of the film. They end up controlling the film, more or less. That's pretty interesting. You know, a number of sort of surreal-ish movies usually not ones that were sort of part of original movements of surrealism, but often newer movies that are kind of vamping on those things, feel the need to explain what really happened, feel the need to disambiguate between some sort of trip or some sort of dream or hallucination and reality. At the end, they wake up and it's all just a dream. And maybe there's some little stinger, oh, but was it? But in general, you know, they maybe open the door a little bit to the possibility of something sort of magical, but they don't totally take it on. It's not totally welcomed to the reality of the film. In this movie, it is. There's nothing at the end that's going to be like, oh, well, it was all just a dream or whatever. No. This is presented as real, earnest possibility in life. Interesting. When watching this movie and thinking about this magic and thinking about the story of these women hijacking a stodgy play and these dream mechanics, I guess, I couldn't help but think about movies, about film, the stodginess that movies can have, and this is often a gendered stodginess, you know? There's a fantasy element to film here. There's a lot of scenes in this movie where Celine and Julia are watching something. I guess they're watching this hallucination play thing, but it looks like they're watching a movie together. The way they go about it, laughing, parodying, sometimes being engaged, but really making their own empathetic sense out of the film, shows a way that you can take ownership of a movie, and maybe in this case, retake ownership of a stodgy movie, writing their own empathetic language on top of it, and eventually, going and modifying it. Right over the course of the movie, we're going to see them explicitly take over this play thing, but even just from the scenes of them watching it, you can tell that in some ways they're kind of in charge, right? So in some ways, I don't know. I think you could think about this movie as thinking about what we should do, how we should approach, how we can watch, understand this old stuff, this stodgy old stuff, and how we can also lead our own, I guess, empowered or whatever, really true lives in that context. And yeah, it's interesting. I think that's a pretty good skeleton for thinking about the movie. This is a cool movie. I've kind of hammered home that it's fun or charming or whatever. I don't want to overdo that. This is a thoughtful movie too. It's an incisive movie, and it's a cool movie. It's got nice cinematography. It's got nice settings. This movie was filmed in Paris, by the way, but you don't see the Eiffel Tower. There's only one thing more Parisian than a movie where you see the Eiffel Tower, and that's a movie where you do not see the Eiffel Tower. There's a few shots in this movie in particular that are really potent. It's hard to explain exactly why, but the boating scene at the end, for instance, is really kind of a stroke of genius. The end in general is great, but this shot of two boats floating past each other is just so strangely beautiful, and it's got life in it. Something about the way things could have been, or the way things were. Ships passing in the night, these different realities floating by. It's hard to put it into words, and I think that's one thing that for me is the mark of a truly great movie, is that it tells a story that is very hard to tell any other way. And this movie, through all of its strangeness, through all of its goofy grammar, through all of these things that don't really make much sense, somehow it ends up making sense profoundly at certain moments. It ends up making up a new language, I guess, where it can express things that are just so hard to get across otherwise. I think that's kind of what a lot of this sort of more surreal stuff can be praised for, in Rivette in particular. So, yeah, this is a great movie. It lives up to the hype, I think, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend it if you don't know the kind of thing you're getting into. Like I said, it's pretty long. It's not exactly exciting. But at the very least, it's charming. And I actually do think, like I said, if you kind of like the hipster lifestyle or whatever, then you might vibe with this right away. And if you're at all interested in sort of the genre I've laid out, you should check it out. Celine and Julie go boating. And you know what? They actually do. Not even false advertising. What more could you want?